Hello and welcome to this quick video on the changing attitudes to punishment in the industrial period. So in this video what we're going to focus on is prisons particularly. So let's look before the 18th century. So before the 18th century, prisons are rarely used as a punishment. What they're actually used for, if you remember, is a holding place for suspects before they go to trial. In terms of the conditions, they were very, very poor, and inmates were mixed. So we have women, children, men all mixed together in these very squalid conditions. However, during the 18th and 19th centuries, the use of imprisonment started to grow, and that's what we're going to kind of look at, how they changed. So the reduction of the bloody code. We know that the bloody code meant that lots of crimes had the execution as a punishment. So by 1688, it was 50 crimes. By 1765, it was 160 different crimes. By 1810, this had increased to 222 crimes, so a huge amount of crimes. However, there started to be a questioning of this, so questioning of the bloody code. So by the early part of the 19th century, the bloody code is questioned completely, and public executions are stopped actually in 1868 as a consequence. We also see during this period an end of transportation. So we know criminals have gone to America, then Australia, but actually transportation to Australia stops in 1868. This is mainly because of changing attitudes in Britain and in Australia. So Australia, many believe that ex-convicts were responsible for high crime rates, so they wanted a stop to it. And in Britain, Australia was starting to become a desirable place to settle. They had discovered gold there, so it looked quite good. So you don't want to send people to somewhere that is desirable. We're now just going to have a quick focus on some reformers. So these are prison reformers. So Elizabeth Fry is one of those. So at the age of 18, Fry starts doing charity work. In 1813, she visits Newgate Prison and she's absolutely appalled by the conditions in there. So women, children, men all mixed together, and she can't believe what she's seeing. So she starts teaching sewing and leads Bible classes at Newgate to encourage rehabilitations because she wants people to be rehabilitated to improve. In 1817, she helped set up the Association of Reformation for Female Prisoners. She organises prison education for women and children. She spends her time writing letters and campaigns for wider reform. She wants a change in prisons. John Howard is another prison reformer. So he goes to a prison in Bedfordshire and he's absolutely outraged by the conditions that he's seeing in these prisons. And he campaigns for prisoners who couldn't afford their release fee to not have to pay it. So he wants that gone as a starter. He also tours different prisons in the country to find good examples of prison, but actually everywhere he goes, he finds very bad conditions. He thought criminals should have the opportunity to change, and the only way to do that is through a reasonable standard of living. So he recommends there should be clean, decent food and useful work for prisoners to do. And he made visits to individual jailers around the country trying to persuade them to do that. So increasing crime rates. Now, during this period, there's increasingly worried about this rise in crime. So between 1800 and 1840, the number of crimes have risen from 5,000 to 20,000. So lots more people committing crimes. So prisons were not usually used, like we said before, as a punishment. But by the early 19th century, they start to be seen as a viable alternative to transportation and execution. Now we're going to look particularly at Pentonville Prison. So this was a prototype that was built in 1842. And the prisoners in Pentonville were kept apart as much as possible. Remember, a prototype is an example, so they're trying to show a new example. They lived in separate cells where they stayed for up to 23 hours a day in their separate cell. So prisoners were given the opportunity for individual improvement. They were encouraged to reform through faith. So this was the idea. They were to be ensured that they were not influenced by other criminals because they were kept apart. And they were trying to deter others from committing crimes. 23 hours a day on your own is a pretty horrible experience. So ensure retribution by making criminals pay. So they're paying for the crimes they've committed. So the basic layout of the prison was that it had 5 different wings. And we'll look at those in a bit more detail in a minute. There was a central area for staff. Each wing was made up of dozens of individual cells, and the prison could accommodate 520 different prisoners. So this is a picture of what it actually looks like. So you can see the 5 different wings, and in there we've got that central cell, and we know there's lots of individual prisons within each of these wings. So the individual cells, now they had a floor area of 4 meters by 2 meters. They had a high window at the end to allow light in, but the window had thick glass, so very thick glass, and all were fixed with iron bars for extra security. The prison had a heating system. It also had a ventilation system. It had piped water to each cell. They had this small basin for washing and basic toilet, and the reason for that is they wanted to ensure that there was no need to ever really leave their cell, so everyone's always in their own cell. In terms of the conditions, so they lived a very highly disciplined life. So prison walls were so thick that they couldn't communicate with one another. Prisoners initially had to work in cells, so boring jobs like cleaning old rope. They were allowed to go out for a very small amount of time for exercise or go to the chapel, and they wore face masks or sat in individual cubicles. So in terms of the conditions, they were very solitary and there was a lack of human contact, and this for many prisoners led to mental illness. So prisoners suffered from depression and psychosis. And psychosis is this confused state where sufferers have hallucinations and delusions. Remember, they're on their own for a very, very long period of time. There starts being calls for change. So Elizabeth Fry, remember, is one of those reformers who wants change, and she wanted prisoners to have the ability to be rehabilitated. But the government weren't really interested in that because they're more interested in deterring potential criminals. So Elizabeth Fry raises these concerns to the prisoner surveyor General Joshua Webb. So I'm going to just read a kind of statement she said. So she said, "These cells appear to me calculated to excite such an awful terror in the mind. I am certain that separate confinement produces an unhealthy state, both of the mind and body, and that therefore everything should be done to counteract this influence. I consider light, air, and the power of seeing something beyond the mere monotonous walls of a cell highly important." So she's very damning of this new prototype and this new system. However, conditions actually become harsher in prison. So in the latter half of the 19th century, the regime becomes even more severe. And the Prisons Act in 1865 actually wants to enforce this very strict uniform regime. And they didn't aim to reform prisoners, but actually Edmund Duquesne sums up when he said that they should have hard labour, hard fare, and hard board. Okay, thank you very much for listening.